Okay, I think we left off talking about propaganda effectiveness and how it's it's most effective when it encompasses all aspects of a person's life. So again, thinking about World War II and how the United States used propaganda to get everybody involved in the war effort and to get everybody involved in essentially supporting the troops in the country as they were waging this war against the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. And in order for this war effort to actually work, right, essentially the United States had to create a propaganda campaign that involved everybody, all people, whether you were a soldier or not a soldier. And in order to get people who were regular civilians and along with the war effort, it had to encompass all aspects of their lives, right? So not necessarily because they were soldiers, but just in terms of what they were doing on their everyday lives as citizens. So, anyways, Laszlo talks about this idea of propaganda effectiveness is heightened during three conditions. And so the first condition is under economic depression. So anytime we have economic depression, where we're having a hard time economically speaking, propaganda tends to be quite effective when there's economic depression. Number two, political conflict. So anytime there is a lot of tension between political parties, like we just witnessed here in the United States. So anytime you have a lot of political conflict, there is also heightens the possibility that propaganda is going to be more effective during this time. And number three would be social conflict. So for instance, a politician could demonize a certain group. So again, the three conditions are economic depression, number two is political conflict, and number three is social conflict, where essentially a politician demonizes a certain group. And so, really, what ends up happening during these three conditions and why propaganda is so effective during this time is because it causes psychosis, right, in our minds. We as humans kind of lose sense of reality during these times, and so because of this is why propaganda tends to be very effective under these three conditions. And so one of the things that he talks about, going to point number two, which is political conflict, he didn't like the idea of debates, which I think is kind of interesting. What he preferred, as opposed to a debate, which can be rather tense, right? Especially the debates that we have here in the United States, he would prefer more of a long debate. Think about those famous debates that Douglas and Lincoln used to have way back in the day, in the 1800s. And so, if you think about currently in the United States, he would like the idea, if he was still alive, this idea of having long podcasts, where essentially the politician talks to a podcaster, and lays out their policy over a 3 or 4 hour period, right? Because getting these short sound bites is not effective. And so another way of thinking about it as opposed to long podcasts would be a long broadcast on television. Again, 2, 3, 4 hours where essentially the person, the host or the is asking the candidate, a series of questions, and then they answer the questions over a long broadcast. And I suppose you can do the same thing for the other candidates as well. These long broadcasts or these long podcasts, as opposed to having debates where they go back and forth. Laswell hated the idea of debates and thought it was terrible for democracy. So think about how Laswell defined propaganda. For him, it's the management of collective attitudes by the manipulation of significant symbols. So again, the management of collective attitudes by the manipulation of significant symbols. And so his idea of propaganda, and I'll talk about this in more detail in the next couple of slides, is that these this eagle or God bless America or the Statue of Liberty or the slogan of the land of the free because of the brave, those slogans or these symbols mean nothing to us, at least initially. But what ends up happening is that over time, right, um, a propagandist can make these various symbols take on significant meanings, right? So again, it's a very slow process. It's a very long process. It takes a long period of time. Just doesn't happen overnight. And so this is I guess you can say the gift or the thing that propagandists do well is that they're able to develop this over a long period of time. They're playing the long game. So think about these symbols um, as we hear the national anthem or the Star Spangled Banner for instance, before significant sporting events. So again, these symbols mean nothing, right? At least initially, but over time they evoke a tremendous sense, a powerful feeling they invoke in us, especially the singing of our national anthem, right? The Star Spangled Banner. This it can touch us on a very deep level, right? Also, think about our flag, or again, think about the eagle and those sorts of things. And so um, Laswell thought, the use of these symbols to evoke powerful feelings was very important in propaganda to get people behind and support um, our government, right? For instance, the American government. And we'll talk more about this in the next couple of. Okay, Harold Laswell's propaganda theory, part two. So, a propagandist can use symbolic manipulation to influence a person. And so, really, you got to go back and think about Freud. We haven't talked about Freud yet, but we will. And so, if you think about and in Freud, we have three parts of a person's mind, right? The superego, the ego, and the id. And so, one of the things that Freud talks about is that if you can get into somebody's unconscious, so that you can make them do things that they wouldn't necessarily want to do. And so essentially what you're getting in, and you're getting into somebody's unconscious, it's just kind of like sort of like their emotional part of their brain, which is, where free will is kind of lost, as you can say. So anyways, what makes this so effective is that essentially what a propagandist is doing is that they're getting into a person's unconscious. So again, they're getting into a person's unconscious. And again, think about Freud because he's very much influenced by the work of Freud. And so propaganda should craft symbols like the flag or the national anthem and teach how to associate specific emotions like love or hate to these symbols very slowly over time. And so again, think about how, at least when I was a kid, right, every day we did the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. And so we've been at least people my age have been socialized over time to have very strong emotions about our flag, for instance. Um, Also our national anthem. The Also, if you think about on the opposite side, symbols to hate, for instance, the Russian flag historically has been a symbol that we've been taught I don't know about hate, but to at the very least distrust, right, over time. If you see the Russian flag, this has happened slowly over time. So one of the things that Laswell talks about, at least goals for propaganda theory, is number one, you want to create master symbols, right? These that associate strong feelings that are going to generate beneficial large-scale mass action. So for instance, if your flag is threatened, or if you feel like your country is threatened, or the symbols of your country are threatened, it's going to evoke very strong feelings for a large number of people. So for instance, right, a lot of people in this country are willing to fight and die for this country, and it's because these symbols are quite meaningful to these individuals, right? And so certainly you could argue that, Laswell, well, that are the people, the powers that be, whoever the powers that be are, have done a masterful job at creating these master symbols that we as Americans have associate strong feelings to these various symbols, whether that the symbols be the flag, whether it be the national anthem, et cetera, et cetera. So an example of what I'm talking about, think about how the military has become intertwined, right, with, like, for instance, sporting events. And so John Oliver does a pretty good job here with this, of talking about how our military and sports have become sort of intertwined. And so you have to also understand that in many cases we have little kids, small kids that go to these sporting events, and again, right, we're sort of slowly indoctrinating these kids into loving our flag and loving the symbols of our country. And I'm not saying anything's wrong with that, but I'm just trying to make the example that, this is how you create master symbols in our country, or just in general, master symbols.
So let's move on to veterans, the only people on Earth who can pull off a camo jacket. Gwyneth. Wednesday is Veterans Day, a chance for Americans around the country to salute those who've served. Although, if you've watched any sporting event any time in the past few years, you could be excused for thinking every day is Veterans Day.
The roar of a military flyover is the highlight of NFL pregame activities.
And the Padres take the field in their camo uni.
Pre-game, a full field flag was unveiled in honor of our troops.
Pay tribute to those who protect our way of life.
There is Dad, home from Korea. And here's a moment that makes you proud to be an American.
Please direct your attention high above the scoreboard and welcome Sergeant First Class Richard Babineau as he rappels down from the arena catwalk for tonight's ceremonial puck drop.
Holy shit! That is awesome! Although, quick tip to the NHL, maybe don't lead off your festivities with something objectively cooler than the product you're presenting. Hope you enjoyed an American hero flying through the air. Now for your main event, 12 bearded Russians engage in full-contact figure skating while trying to whack a flat ball. Unfortunately, though, it turns out while some military tributes were for the right reasons, others may have been a little more self-serving.
You know those moments when you see a military member sing the national anthem or carry out the American flag at a game? Well, an unprecedented congressional review has found those moments are often actually paid for by the Department of Defense.
The investigation showed that as many as 72 contracts were in place with up to 50 pro sports teams.
That's right. This week, we learned the full extent of how the US military had been quietly paying sports teams in exchange for seemingly genuine emotional moments, a phenomenon usually reserved for the girlfriend experience section of Craigslist casual encounters. And the details of some of these deals are amazing. The Air Force paid the Dallas Mavericks $5,000 for a package that included throwing out T-shirts that the Air Force itself provided, and the National Guard paid the Atlanta Falcons to recognise its birthday. And that is so sad. That's what a mom does for her socially inept third grader. Listen, if you come to Gregory's party for 45 minutes, I'll get you an Xbox One, but you have to talk to him and you cannot deny you came. Now, The response to this story from the leagues has been unimpressive. NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell promised if they find any inappropriate payments were made, they will be refunded in full. And the Commissioner of Major League Baseball claimed the teams didn't always collect the money in the contracts, and even when they did, there was some important context we should all bear in mind.
I think that our clubs, for the minuscule amount of money involved here, it's just not material to their business. And I think that the amount of things that we do free for the military, hundreds and hundreds of fold, makes up for whatever small payments are involved in these contracts.
No, it doesn't. And you just made this even grosser. You're basically saying, well, maybe we did take your money, but we're so rich, we didn't even need it. And besides, we've done so much for veterans, a little thank you for your service would be nice for a change.
Most of the pain will be felt by working.
So again, right, I agree with Oliver's point about how clever the military has become in terms of like intertwining itself with sports and being able to craft these, very strong feelings amongst all fans, not just necessarily young fans, especially, obviously if you think about that, like anytime you see a military person come home and you see them hugging their kids, for instance, you got to feel something. And so I think the military has done a very good job. I think our government in general has done a very good job of being able to create these master symbols. And so the second goal under Laszlo's propaganda theory is that to use propaganda for good. So again, use propaganda for good. And he called it the science of democracy. So he didn't think of it as this evil thing. So again, this idea of using democracy for good. One last thing before I move on to the next theory. Laszlo is also famous for talking about the garrison state. It's something that he wrote way back, I think, in the 1940s, and basically talking about how the military and our politicians have become more and more entwined, and basically kind of warning our country to not have the military be such a political force in our country. And so he was kind of warning us before Eisenhower actually warned us about the military-industrial complex, that the military would become an incredibly powerful political force in our country. And so Laszlo sort of was also warning us of that way back in the 1940s. So Laswell's model of communication theory is probably one of the more famous theories that he did. So basically what it is, it's the effect depends on the relationship between the media user and the audience. So again, the effect depends on the relationship between the media user and the audience. So certainly if you think about just our current past election, right? Obviously Donald Trump is, when he's using the media, and his audiences are a bunch of Democrats, and obviously the effect is going to be much different if Donald Trump is talking to, let's just say, of a lot of Republicans. And so the effect is going to differ depending on who is the media user. Just like, for instance, Joe Biden, right? Biden, if you were a Democrat or Republican, it's going to have a different effect for you depending on who you are politically speaking. And so one of the things that you have to understand about this particular theory is that essentially every situation, right, and every different type of media have changed the effect, right? So again, different media will have a different effect. The situation will have a different effect. So for instance, Harold Laszlo would argue that, for instance, if you think about the famous Nixon and Kennedy debates. So if somebody listened to debates on radio, it appeared that Nixon won the debate. If you watched a debate on television, then because Kennedy was this good-looking dude, I guess he had gone to the beach and got a suntan, and so just from being more attractive, he appeared to have won the debate on television. So it all depended on the medium that you watched the debate on. If you listened to it on radio, Nixon won. If you watched it on television, Kennedy won, largely because, he's a better looking guy and he looked better on television, so the effect was different. And again, the situations are also going to change, have an effect. So if you're surrounded, again, if you're listening to Donald Trump speak and you're surrounded by a bunch of Republicans or fans of Donald Trump, that's going to have a different effect as opposed to, let's say, if you're listening to Donald Trump and you're sitting with or next to a lot of Democrats. The situation is going to have a different effect. And so one of the things that Harold Laswell talks about is that media can change the behavior of some people, but not all people. But what was assumed was that it was going to have some sort of effect. How much of an effect? Well, we don't know, right? It goes back to the idea of limited effects. It's going to have an effect. We just can't necessarily measure how much of an effect. But an effect is assumed regardless. And so again, this is his famous theory. It's this idea of the one-way communication. I'm sure most of you have seen this one-way communication before of who is the speaker, what is the message, the channel or the medium, whom, right, who is the audience, and what is the effect. This is the one-way communication model that Laswell utilized and that he's famous for. And so as you can see here, right, the weakness is that according to this theory, or the critics of this particular theory, is that we place too much importance on the speaker. That's the weakness of this particular theory. And also the weakness is that we have no ability to provide feedback in one-way communication, which isn't necessarily true, because if you think about it, right, if you can boo, it's a form of a feedback, or you can apply, or you can be a cheer, it's another form of feedback. It also doesn't take into account a noise. And so, for example, let's just say that you're listening to something on the radio and your little kid starts to cry, or your wife starts to talk to you, or you get distracted by something, and so you no longer heard the message, so it doesn't take into account the noise. And so some people would argue, for instance, and this is something to think about, right? Some people would argue that that we can respond to a negative message, for instance, on social media. And so therefore we feel more empowered on social media than we do on traditional media, because we feel like in traditional media we really can't respond, right? And which is, on some level, it's true, right? Because if you're not in the live audience, then you really can't provide feedback. And on social media, you actually, I guess, sort of can. But the question then becomes, right, especially if you're reading social media from, let's say, Donald Trump or anybody else who uses social media extensively, is do these influential people are they really reading your responses? And that's really the question. And maybe they are, or maybe they're not, but really in reality, at the end of the day, at least in my opinion, of course, isn't social media just a more effective way of communicating a brief message to you, in a brief one-way communication in most cases for these influential people, right? Because they're sending you a message and you're reacting to this message, just having an effect on you. And so on some level, they want to have an effect on you by sending you this message. And so also some would argue that whenever you watch a movie, right, these movies tend to have, again, very much can be very powerful in terms of their messages, and they resonate with you because usually in a movie theater, there isn't necessarily noise. And because there's no noise, oftentimes these messages, right, are sometimes even more impactful and have even more of an effect on you. So here's some cool movie lines that, may have had an effect on you or maybe not, depending on whether or not you've watched these movies.
Santiago was a substandard Marine. He was being transferred.
That's not what you said. You said he was being transferred because he was in grave danger.
That's correct.
You said he was in danger. I said grave danger. You said, is there any
recall what I said.
I can have the court reporter read back to you.
I know what I said. I don't have to have it read back to me like I'm...
Why the two orders? Colonel?
Sometimes men take matters into their own hands.
No, sir. You made it clear just a moment ago that your men never take matters in their own hands. Your men follow orders or people die. So Santiago shouldn't have been in any danger at all, should he have, Colonel?
You snotty little bastard.
Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess. I'd like an answer to the question, Judge.
The court will wait for an answer.
If Lieutenant Kendrick gave an order that Santiago wasn't to be touched, then why did he have to be transferred? Colonel? Lieutenant Kendrick ordered the code red, didn't he? Because that's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do.
Object!
And when it went bad, you cut these guys loose! Your Honor, you had Marcus inside a phony transfer. Your Honor, you doctored the logbook. Damn it, Captain! You coerced the doctor.
Consider yourself in contempt.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled to.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth! Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives. And my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
Did you order the code red?
I did the job. Did you order the code red?
You're damn right I did!
Please, the court, I suggest the members be dismissed so that we can move to an immediate Article 39A session. The witness has rights.
Captain Ross.
Jack?
The members of the court will retire to an anteroom until further instructed.
All rise.
What the hell is this? Colonel, what's going on? I did my job. I do it again. I'm gonna get on a plane and go on back to my base.
You're not going anywhere, Colonel. MPs, guard the Colonel.
Yes, sir.
Captain Ross.
What the hell is
Colonel
this?
Jessup, you have the right to remain silent. Any statement?
I'm being charged with a crime.
A trial by court-martial.
Is that what this is?
Or administrative.
I'm being charged with a crime?
You have the right to consult with a lawyer prior to any further questioning.
This is funny.
This lawyer may be a civilian
That's what
lawyer
this
appointed
is.
by you at your
This
own
is-
expense.
I'm gonna rip the eyes out of your head
Puke into your dead skull. You messed with the wrong Marine.
Colonel Jessup, do you understand these rights as I've just read them to you?
You friggin' people. You have no idea how to defend a nation. All you did was weaken a country today, Caffey. That's all you did. You put people's lives in danger. Sweet dreams, son.
Don't call me son. I'm a lawyer and an officer in the United States Navy. And you're under arrest, you son of a...
So anyways, this speech is pretty powerful. And depending again whether or not you like military films, you like Tom Cruise, you like Jack Nicholson, depending on which kind of how you watch this particular movie, whether you watched it in your living room or did you watch it alone in your living room, did you watch it with friends, did you watch it in a movie theater, the effect that it's going to have to you is going to vary depending on the environment that you're in. And certainly one of the things that makes movies so powerful oftentimes is that we're sitting in this dark space, and oftentimes it's hopefully quiet, and so it tends to be very engaging. And so this is why movies oftentimes, at least movies in a movie theater, I would argue tend to have more of an effect on us than, let's say, you watch the same movie, let's say in the living room where it's maybe perhaps not so quiet. And why? Because you have more noise in a living room, for instance, and more distractions. So anyways, moving on to the next theory. The next theory is the functional approach to mass comm. And so this is what Laswell and Wright. And so they took essentially Laswell's model of communication and developed another theory off of that particular theory. And so basically illustrates how media plays an important role in our society. And so one of the things that they basically concluded from this particular theory was that some free will is assumed. Again, think about, Freud. And so that's important to think about, that idea of free will, because that is a question that a lot of philosophers have, is how much free will do we really have as humans? And so Laswell and Wright argued that we do have some free will. And so basically they argue that people use media for many functions. So again, they're arguing against this idea that media is all powerful and that people are powerless. They're essentially arguing that the opposite. They're actually arguing that, people use media and media doesn't use people. And so people uses media for many functions. Again, if you think about it, it's to be entertained or to be informed or et cetera, et cetera. Now, this is an important point about this particular theory, is that, and this is to bear in mind, just keep this important piece and noted in your head. Powerful people may use media to slant, right? Slant information, censor information, elevate the importance of information. So basically they're arguing this idea that, that we should be very wary of people and how they use media. And we should be watching media with a very critical eye, with the understanding that media content can be slanted to a certain direction. So this idea that, the media is objective or that journalists are objective is not true. They also argue that you can censor out important information. Again, if you censor out important information, it can totally change the story. And then also elevate the importance of information. So think about agenda setting, which they're not necessarily talking about in this particular theory, but they're kind of suggesting the idea of agenda setting. So you can elevate the importance of information in a society. For instance, I'll give you an example. When the bad snowstorm happened in Texas, one of the things that was played on our media was the fact that Ted Cruz went to Cancun, left Texas and went to Cancun. I mean, is that really an important story? I mean, I don't know. I don't really think it's that important. But I felt like it got more play on the news. I don't watch that much news, but the little bit of news that I did watch, that got more play than Biden bombing Syria. That didn't get a whole lot of play. So this again goes back to the point that it can elevate the importance of information. So is Cruz going to Cancun more important than Biden bombing Syria? Now, I would personally say no, but the point being is, again, that powerful people in powerful positions can elevate the importance of information, right? They can make it very important or not important at all, for instance, on the other hand. And so what are the three functions of communication according to Laswell? So number one is surveillance. So again, number one is surveillance. Surveillance essentially means this idea of surveying our society and gathering news, information that's going to be communicated to us as citizens in terms of what's important. Correlation is number two, correlation. So correlations, in other words, are going to be the stories that we actually select, right, amongst all this information, how we're going to provide interpretation of how we're actually addressing this particular issue, for instance, and then responds, right? Like, so provide a survey, an information about why this story or this issue is important, and then how we're going to respond to this particular issue. So again, select stories that are important, interpret or help us make sense of these stories, and then respond. In other words, letting us know how we're responding to this particular issue. And then number three would be cultural transmission. So number three, cultural transmission. So the dissemination of what are American values, what are American norms. So again, surveillance is number one, correlation is number two, and number three is cultural transmission. Now, Wright, as you can see here later on, adds two more components to the important functions of communication. And according to Wright, these 4 and 5 are, number 4 is to entertain. So that's an important function, is this idea of keeping people entertained. The idea of escapism, although some people frown on that, it is kind of an important part, is this idea of being able to sort of occasionally being able to escape your circumstances. So again, number 4, entertain. Number 5, to mobilize. And so mobilize is important. So anytime you have a disaster, for instance, let's say it's the big snowstorm in Texas, or maybe it's a hurricane, or maybe it's a tornado. And so the media plays an important role in helping to mobilize us as a country. And so an example of what I'm talking about, think about the fact that we're long overdue for a earthquake. And so what do we do when we have an earthquake? As somebody who lived through the Northridge earthquake, I actually lived in Northridge when the Northridge quake happened. And so let me tell you, it was not good. And so what do? Are we prepared to be on our own for at least 24 hours to 48 hours? Because despite the fact that Northridge was, pretty scary and it was bad, it's not nearly as bad of a quake as we're expected to get hit by in who knows when, but they say this next quake is going to be much larger than the Northridge earthquake.
Geologists are out with a very startling warning that Southern California is overdue for a major and possibly catastrophic earthquake. A new study says it's expected to hit along the San Andreas Fault north of Los Angeles. It could have a magnitude of 7.5 or higher. That's big. For the first time, scientists are closer to knowing when it could strike. CBS News science and futurist contributor Michio Kaku is a physics professor at the City University of New York City. Good morning to you, Professor. When I went to see you in the green room, you said, I'm here with doom and gloom. But let me tell you, I grew up in high school and junior high. We've been hearing about an earthquake coming in California for years. What makes this different?
Well, before it was all hocus pocus and black magic predicting earthquakes. And I was born in California, 10 miles from the San Andreas Fault, living under the shadow of the big one. Now we can quantify this. And we now know that the San Andreas Fault is locked, loaded, and ready to rumble. We now realize that the people of Los Angeles are living on borrowed time. We now know that by digging into the soil, we can go down 1,200 years into the past, looking at soil laid down hundreds of years ago, and we find 10 major earthquakes in the last 1,000 years. The difference in time is roughly 100 years on average. The last big one was 160 years ago. So according to one calculation, we're 60 years overdue for another big one.
You're talking about the great 1857 quake, right?
That's right. It was a huge 7.9 earthquake that was so big it actually liquefied the soil north of Los Angeles, like halfway between Bakersfield and L.A.
And the tremors in that quake, by some reports, it lasted up to 3 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're not talking about just a few seconds, like maybe in a Northridge type earthquake. We're talking about an earthquake that lasts for minutes. And also the U.S. Geologic Survey did an estimate of property damage. What could happen if the 1857 earthquake happens today? The numbers are frightening. $200 billion in property damage. That's billion with a B. 50,000 people injured. 5 major skyscrapers toppled because of a gigantic earthquake, a 7.8 in this study.
Well, you're not sweetness and light this morning with the information you're giving, but it is important. So if we live in if people who live in that area, what would you recommend them to do other than freak out?
First of all, don't panic, because the next big earthquake could happen decades from now.
That's counterintuitive, Professor.
We don't know precisely when. Seismology is not a predictive science. However,
don't panic.
Schools. I think schools should have a special session to teach their kids what to do, where to go, how to communicate in the process of an earthquake. Families should meet with everyone in the family. Do you have batteries, first aid kits, water, food? Who do you contact with? Do you have like a radio, a transistor radio? Little things like this.
They should have that.
They should have that.
Right now.
Right now. And then longer term, building codes have to be accentuated, I think. And also power lines have to be reinforced and redundancies so we have power and buildings don't collapse unnecessarily.
You're saying we may have decades, though. I mean, the energy's been building up, but it could be, I mean, we could be another 10, 20, 30 years.
It could be tomorrow. It could be decades from now. We just know that the San Andreas Fault has been moving at about 1 inch a year. So it's like winding up a clock. It gets tighter and tighter. 1 inch a year is the rate at which it's been tightening.
Wow.
Therefore, it's a law of physics. All that tension has got to go someplace. And so it's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
So again, right, think about the role the important role that media is going to play in mobilizing us in terms of like when a disaster occurs. It's like, how do we mobilize our country to help the people who are in need? And again, Wright talks about the importance of mobilizing, and that media plays an important role in helping to mobilize people within our society. So narcotic dysfunction theory by Lazarsfeld and Merton. And Merton and Lazarsfeld are very important people. They really are the people who invented focus groups, and they really illustrated the importance of doing focus groups to sort of glean information from people. So again, they really invented focus groups and really illustrated the importance of conducting focus groups in order to glean or get information from people that otherwise you wouldn't be able to get for instance, in a quantitative study. And so they really helped with qualitative research methods a great deal by developing, again, focus groups. And so they're famous for this particular theory called narcotic dysfunction theory. So obviously, a dysfunction is not good for a mass society, for any society. This idea of dysfunction, this idea of not working well. And so basically what they've discovered in this particular theory is that essentially in our society, we are inundated with too many stories. And so because we're inundated with so many stories coming at us, from every direction, that we essentially as people, we become passive or confused about an issue, right? So because we're just getting inundated with all these different, stories, we don't know what is the truth. And because we don't know what is the truth, we essentially become passive or confused. And so one of the things they talk about is this idea that oftentimes we mistaken, especially in the United States, this idea of knowledge is that just because we've watched it or read it, or the fact that we've discussed it, that still means it still equals passivity, right? Or no action. But oftentimes we mistaken knowledge or discussion for actual action. But in reality, it's not. It's just because I know about the problem doesn't mean I'm fixing the problem. Just because we discussed the problem also doesn't mean we fixed the problem. That still equals passivity or no action. And so, unfortunately, in our society, right, we've fallen under the spell of the notion that society believes, right, that because we know it, therefore we solve the issue. But that's not true. Right? We believe knowledge solves the issue, but it doesn't solve the issue. We're still being passive about it. We haven't solved anything just because we know it's a problem, right? And so the idea is that, again, mixed or confusing messages result in no action. So mixed or confusing messages result in no action, which is, again, a dysfunction, or in some ways you can call it narcotic, in a sense that it's like we're being narcotized with the drug. So in the United States, for instance, they argue that the people here in the United States have this superficial concern, but it's not a real concern. And so one of the things they talk about, think about the confusion regarding the pandemic, right? Until recently, there hasn't seemed to be a real consistent message about the pandemic. Think about the confusion about wearing masks or no masks. And so one of the things, and this is one of the points that I didn't write down here, but two important points that they talk about with this particular theory is, number one, media enhances the authority of a person or a group. So again, media enhances the authority of a person or a group. And number two, reaffirms public norms by exposing deviation. So number one, the media enhances the authority of a person or a group. And number two, it reaffirms public norms by exposing deviation. So for instance, on my Facebook account, right, there was a lot of people who, for instance, were all about wearing masks and all about social distancing, which I guess it's fine. We did the same. But they would actually put people on blast or criticize people, for instance, for people having parties or for gathering with their families, because they weren't necessarily following the mandate of social distancing, of staying at home, those sorts of orders. They were essentially exposing deviation. And so one of the things that Lazarsfeld and Merton talk about with narcotic dysfunction is that this is what happens. This is what the media creates with narcotic dysfunction. Again, it enhances the authority of a person or a group, which we did see during the pandemic. And it also, number two, it reaffirms public norms by exposing deviation. So think about whether or not you think social media helps or hurts us as voters.
Welcome to the brave new world of social media, where most of us get our news and political information. The upside is we get to participate in this conversation as never before. We comment, we share, we tweet, we retweet. But our favorite social networks have also amped up the power of the opinionators. Sometimes this activates us.
Because if there is ever a time to stand, the time is now.
And sometimes it feeds us distortion.
It's just a stupid opinion. I mean, it's a misunderstanding of...
My name's Juana Summers, and I'm an editor for CNN Politics based in Washington, D.C. One of the great things and one of the horrible things about social media is that everybody can have their say. It's kind of a marketplace of ideas, and some voices that sometimes are not correct or have a very partisan slant can oftentimes get amplified.
It wasn't always this way. With Trayvon Martin's killing in 2012 by George Zimmerman, we saw a new pattern of coverage emerge. Trayvon's death became a meme that led to an agenda war on social media and a now familiar shouting match on cable television, with wildly diverging narratives based on where you turned or clicked.
Jim Rutenberg, media columnist, The New York Times. We are in a whole new world where Twitter, Facebook, and social media are driving coverage nationwide. So CNN, Fox, MSNBC is going to pick one side, and if enough people like the way it sounds and want to believe it, it's off to the races.
The wheels are in motion for a complete character assassination of Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin behaving in a thuggish manner, assaulting George Zimmerman.
If you want to look for a thug, how about the guy who chased down the 17-year-old and shot him in the chest?
What we want when we're covering race is some kind of national conversation that leads us somewhere good. But if you're only going with the divided take, us against them, right against left, it's hard to see us coming to some place of reconciliation.
Now that we can program our own news diet online, it's even easier to seek out what we want to believe. The irony is that instead of expanding our worldview, social networks can easily become accomplices in shrinking it.
I'm Brooke Gladstone, the co-host and managing editor of On the Media, a national program produced by WNYC. There is a tendency in the digital media for a heightened phenomenon to occur, incestuous amplification. If you are in an echo chamber where you're only speaking to like-minded people, it tends to heighten the extreme voices and marginalize the moderate ones. It creates an atmosphere that is incredibly intolerant online.
And if Facebook is your go-to news source, it pays to understand how it works.
Facebook's main goal is to keep you on its site. Its algorithm is set up to give you what you want. An algorithm is a formula that Facebook engineers have put together to maybe even know what you like before you know what you like.
If you don't relish the idea of a computer algorithm responding to your likes and dislikes, you have to figure out how to curate your news for yourself. Certainly, the news choices that you make will help determine your view of an event, of the world. Even more important your view of the world determines what your news choices are. It really begins with you. So the question is, what do you do?
I would love it if I could tell every person in America to read something you violently disagree with once a week. If you're a diehard MSNBC watcher, go turn on Fox. If you love to read Breitbart and Town Hall, go listen to NPR for a day. Maybe there's something there for you to challenge your assumptions and the things that you typically read.
You can employ deputy curators on Twitter, say. You find people who are experts in the areas that you care about, going beyond the usual suspects and actually clicking further distances than you normally do.
If you're just swiping through your Facebook or your Twitter, go past the headline or the image that you're seeing and ask, what's the full story? What's the source of the information? And just being really critical of that.
Today, it only takes a minute to Google something you see online and find out if it's been updated or fact-checked.
Don't reflexively retweet. You are feeding back into the system that is feeding into you. You're a part of this now.
The great news about the advent of social media is that there's more information at your fingertips. You can take advantage of that, and you can be the best informed citizen in history.
In the digital age, everyone with a keyboard can be a creator or a distributor of content. We have more power than ever, and with that comes responsibility. It's on us to be our own media keepers and to engage thoughtfully in the evolving landscape of digital democracy.
So again, think about how our social media, even if you watch the documentary Social Dilemma, has sort of created this narcotic dysfunction in our society, right? Because we have access to so much information and we can no longer make sense of what is true or false. And so now we've become either passive or confused about what we're actually reading, right, in many cases, especially on social media. And again, don't forget about the 2 points that I made, that the media during narcotic dysfunction enhances the authority of a person or a group, and number 2, reaffirms public norms by exposing deviation. Social judgment theory, or the Hovland studies by Sharif and Hovland. Great study done in the 40s. And so they studied the Why We Fight series. And so the Why We Fight series is essentially a series of documentaries that was produced right before we got involved in World War II, or as we were getting involved in World War II. And they were produced by Frank Capra. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the Why We Fight series, but here is an example of the Why We Fight series, just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about.
Causes and events leading up to our entry into the war. Well, what are the causes? Why are we Americans on the march? Is it because of Pearl Harbor? Is that why we are fighting? Or is it because of Britain?
So now you got a sense of what the Why We Fight series was. It's a series of documentaries. It was 7 of them produced. It was produced, directed by Frank Capra. Frank Capra, a great Hollywood director. He did probably your favorite or one of the best Christmas movies in the history of Hollywood. It's a Wonderful Life. You may have watched his Christmas movies over Christmas. Or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is another one of his favorite famous films. But anyways, all the soldiers who were about to get drafted into this war had to watch these 7 documentaries, trying to essentially convince them that being a part of the military, being part of this war effort was worth it. Because, I mean, let's think about it, right? If you're a 20-year-old kid, I mean, do you really want to get a gun and start, waging war against, these other countries? Because chances are very good that you could get killed in this war. And so, the Why We Fight series essentially was a propaganda tool to essentially convince soldiers that, this was a worthwhile cause to die for, essentially. And so one of the things that Hovland discovered during this study was that this idea of the sleeper effect. So essentially the Why We Fight series was a series of 7 propaganda films. And the soldiers, innately kind of knew this was propaganda. But what he discovered through the sleeper effect was that over time, even though it's propaganda, you're more apt to believe it to be true. So even though, again, the sleeper effect is, even though it's propaganda, or it's not necessarily being truthful, over time you believe it to be true. This is why, for instance, you see a lot of political advertising happening right before an election occurs. These ads are slanted, right? They're not objective, but over time you believe them to be true. So anyways, one of the things I discovered was that essentially the receivers of a message, right, in this case the soldiers, had 3 choices. They could either accept what they were seeing, reject what they were seeing, or essentially be indifferent or not have non-commitment towards this particular issue. And so 4 questions that they kind of examined in this study was: how likely will a person change their position? What will be their likely direction of a person's attitude change, either from accept to reject? Let's say, for instance, if they were indifferent. How tolerant of other people's positions are other folks, and how committed is a person to their positions? These are essentially 4 of their basic questions that they had as they went into this particular study. So one thing they discovered while doing this particular study was this idea of the anchor. And the anchor essentially is your current position, right? It's your standard. And so essentially your anchor is going to determine your latitude of acceptance. In other words, how narrow of a band is the acceptance, or how wide the acceptance is, how narrow the rejection band is, or how wide it is, or indifference in terms of how narrow it is or how wide. So think about the latitude in terms of narrow, or how narrow or how broad your latitudes are is dependent on your anchor. And again, your anchor is your current position, or your standard. It determines, again, the latitude of acceptance, your latitude of rejection, as well as the latitude of indifference, whether it's going to be a large range or a small range. And so attitude change, they discovered, are based on 3 things. Number 1, it's ego involvement. So your self-identity, how involved are you with this particular issue, or how highly involved do you feel emotionally, affects the number of choices, right? So again, your self-identity, or how emotionally invested you feel in this particular issue, affects choices. Again, affects choices. Number 2, the number of options is dependent on your ego involvement. So number of options are dependent on your ego involvement. So if you have less ego involvement, for instance, there's more acceptable choices. So more ego involvement means less acceptable choices. So again, number of options are affected by ego involvement. The more your ego's involved, the less acceptable choices there are. The less your ego's involved, the more acceptable choices there are. And the third was what's the impact of the source's credibility? So the source's credibility is the third element in attitude change. So if you believe a source to be truthful, it could lead to attitude change. Or if you didn't find the source to be credible, again, it could lead to attitude change. So if you want somebody's attitude to be changed, the source needs to be credible. So think about this particular commercial in terms of whether or not you think this commercial does a good job of perhaps creating an attitude change towards Dove, for instance.
I'm a forensic artist. Worked for the San Jose Police Department from 1995 to 2011.
I showed up to a place I'd never been, and there was a guy with a drafting board.
We couldn't see them, they couldn't see us.
Tell me about your hair.
I didn't know what he was doing, but then I could tell after several questions that he was drawing me.
Tell me about your chin.
It kind of protrudes a little bit, especially when I smile.
Your jaw.
My mom told me I had a big jaw.
What would be your most prominent feature?
I kind of have a fat, rounder face.
The older I've gotten, the more freckles I've gotten.
I would say I have a pretty big forehead.
Once I get a sketch, I say thank you very much, and then they leave. I don't see them.
All I had been told before the sketch was to get friendly with this other woman, Chloe.
Today I'm going to ask you some questions about a person you met earlier, and I'm going to ask you some general questions about their face.
She was thin, so you could see her cheekbones. And her chin, it was a nice, thin chin.
She had nice eyes. They lit up when she spoke.
Cute nose.
She had blue eyes, very nice blue eyes.
So here we are. This is the sketch that you helped me create, and that's a sketch that somebody described of you.
So yeah, that's...
She looks closed off and fatter, sadder too. The second one looks more open, friendly, and happy.
I should be more grateful of my natural beauty. It impacts the choices and the friends that we make, the jobs we apply for, how we treat our children. It impacts everything. It couldn't be more critical to your happiness.
Do you think you're more beautiful than you say?
Yeah. Yeah.
We spend a lot of time as women analyzing and trying to fix the things that aren't quite right. And we should spend more time appreciating the things that we do like.
So again, the question is, right, do you find this advertisement to be effective in terms of creating attitude change, right? And so part of that, if you do find it effective in terms of changing your particular attitude about Dove, part of it is going to be involve your ego, right? So the more your ego is involved in let's say in the topic of beauty, it's going to affect the number of choices. And so let's just say that you don't like Dove, and you really you feel like you know a lot about the beauty industry. So this particular commercial is may not, or is probably not going to change your opinion about Dove. You're not going to use it because your ego's heavily involved, and because you've already decided, I don't like Dove. So you're not going to find the source to be credible. Now, on the other hand, let's just say that you're kind of, maybe your ego is not totally invested in the idea of beauty for whatever reason. And so you're kind of more open to using products that are going to enhance your beauty, or you potentially might enhance your beauty. And so you might find this particular commercial to be credible. And so in that particular case, you might be more open to use a product like Dove if your ego isn't highly invested in the topic of beauty, for instance. Okay, so part 3 of social judgment theory. So obviously more ego involvement means that you're more likely to experience cognitive dissonance. So in other words, you feeling like you're wrong is more likely to cause dissonance within yourself, right? So you're more likely to try to rationalize your choices. So again, more ego involvement, you're more likely to experience the idea of cognitive dissonance, this idea of feeling uncomfortable, right? So again, there's less acceptable options with more ego involvement. This is key because in terms of finding the latitude of non-commitment, because again, right, obviously if your ego is highly invested, that means your latitude of non-commitment or latitude of indifference is going to be narrow. And so contrast effect. So basically with more ego involvement, you're going to be harder to persuade because of the contrast effect. So again, harder to persuade because of the contrast effect. So in other words, the message, regardless of the message, or most messages, I should say, are more likely, a message is more likely to fall into the latitude of rejection. So again, contrast effect means message more likely falls into the latitude of rejection. So again, you're harder to persuade because of the contrast effect. So message more likely falls into latitude of rejection. So you can also include the idea of more messages are likely to fall into the latitude of rejection. So again, it's more difficult to convince you or to change your opinion when your ego is highly involved. So with less ego involvement, obviously there's more acceptable options. And again, this is the key to finding the latitude of non-commitment or indifference, which means that if you have less ego involvement, your latitude of non-commitment or indifference is going to be wider, right, or broader. And so you're going to be easier to persuade with less ego involvement. So the reason why you're easier to persuade with less ego involvement is called the assimilation effect. Assimilation effect, which means a message is more likely falls into the latitude of acceptance. So message more likely falls into the latitude of acceptance. So again, with less ego involvement. So again, less ego involvement, you're easier to persuade. More ego involvement, harder. Social judgment theory, part 4. So latitude of non-commitment or indifference. So the greater the difference to a person's anchor, the more a person will adjust. But it has to fall into the latitude of acceptance. So these are the individuals that you can most likely, if they're indifferent, you can convince them to accept something. So for instance, right, let's just say that you wanted to have your significant other wants to have, let's say, I don't know, Italian food, but you don't really, but they don't seem very committed about the idea of Italian, just kind of like one of their choices. And they don't really have a great deal of ego. They're not a foodie or anything like that. So you could probably convince them of a different type of cuisine other than Italian. And so maybe you can argue with them and say, or ask them and say, well, what about Greek food? It's fairly close to Italian. The cuisine isn't a whole lot different. How about Greek? That person, because they're not committed or indifferent about food, they're more apt to say, okay, that's fine. It falls into the latitude of acceptance. So the boomerang effect, what exactly is that? Boomerang effect basically means it's an incidental attitude change. In other words, it leads into the opposite direction. So if you think about PSAs, right? PSAs tell you don't drive and text, or don't drink and drive. Those sorts of things sometimes have the opposite effect. In other words, it leads into the opposite direction. So if you think about anti-smoking PSAs, sometimes may result in somebody rebelling against those messages and actually starting to smoke because they see those. So in other words, what I'm trying to get at is that fear tactics don't work in advertising. So for example,
หนูดูดเองจริงเหรอไม่ได้หรอกมั้งอายุยังน้อยอยู่เป็นมะเร็งเนี่ยต้องไปเจาะคอไม่กลัวหมอผ่าตัดแล้วน้องบุหรี่มันมียาพิษอยู่นะมันทำให้หน้าเหี่ยวด้วยนะสูบบุหรี่แล้วก็ตายเร็วไม่อยากอยู่เล่นนานๆนะมันไม่ดีรู้เปล่าสูบแล้วเป็นทั้งมะเร็งปอดร่วมโป่งพองไม่ดีแล้วพี่ดูดทำไมล่ะคะ
So as effective as this ad might be in terms of like trying to get people to stop quitting, again, it may actually have, the opposite effect for actually non-smokers, and actually, make people who watch these PSAs go from non-smokers to smokers, because they're essentially changing their attitude on the idea of smoking. And so this is again called a boomerang effect, or an incidental attitude change. And so significant others, like your boyfriend, girlfriend, your if you go to church, right, your friends, if you're a member of a frat or sorority, those sorts of folks, people who are around you, who you think of as significant, they play an important role in changing your attitudes. But that said, right, most attitude change will be very small or very minor in almost every single case, unless they have little to no ego involvement. Then the change might be drastic.